To introduce myself, my name is Dan Greenfield. I run the website 13th Dimension. Just as a brief introduction, I've been reading comic books since I can remember, really, since I was maybe 4 or 5 years old. And if you're, like most of yourselves, you've probably read hundreds, if not thousands of them in your lifetime. But there are certain writers and there are certain artists who whose impact is not only just greater on the industry, but also that speak to you personally. And for me, the writer who's among the very best and whose work affected me most deeply growing up and even to this day is sitting to my left. It's Mr. Denny O'Neil. I would like to welcome here today to East Coast Comics. We are recording this possibly to be used as a podcast. Also, there will be a report on this on 13th Dimension in the coming weeks. We did solicit questions from readers, and also people here in the room will be able to. Denny throwing his hat in the ring. They have a question for himself, but we'll also we'll have an opportunity to have you folks ask a lot of questions as well. So Denny, welcome. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
I saw that you had a very long line. Your wrist must be falling off already from how much signing you've done today. I'm going to ask a question. It's a pretty basic question. Some people may know it, some people may not, but it actually comes from one of our readers at 13th Dimension, a guy named Jason Douglas, who asked simply, how did you get into the comic book industry?
Purely by accident and with not intending to. I was a huge fan of kids comics when I was like 6. Sunday Mass, Dad and I went to St. Philip Mary's, and then on the way home he stopped a little mom and pop store and got milk for the family and a comic book for me. I think that was the first experience I had with reading. And I love the things, but you didn't put them in plastic bags. We traded them, a little wagon up and down Claxton Avenue. And then,
where was this? Where was this that you grew up?
In St. Louis, Missouri. Yeah, a very different neighborhood there. We were there a few years ago. Anyway, along comes high school, and I now know that comic books had lost most of their retail venues. There was no place to buy the things anymore after the war. Along came paperback books. If you've got a limited amount of display space, what are you going to do? The dime you'll get for the paperback or the 2 cents you'll get for the comic. And then there was the witch hunts with Dr. Frederick Wortham and Senator Estes Kefauver going on the rampage because another politician, Tail Gunner Joe McCarthy, was getting huge publicity for accusing people in the government of communism. I have in my hand a list of 11 known communist agents, and he had his grocery list. But it became a hot thing to do, to be a witch hunter. And then Dr. Wortham, in my world, in the world of comic books, that's a nasty word. I have just cussed Wortham. And I don't think he was a bad guy. He gave free medical help to people in Harlem. He was one of the first people to fight for the integration of the public school system. But he had a blind spot when it came to pop culture. And I never met the man, but I would be surprised if he didn't see an opportunity to become a star. What's interesting about that is 3 years ago, a lovely young woman named Carol Tilley was going for her doctorate in library science at University of Illinois in Springfield, I think. And all these years, there had been, Wortham was either a champion of the right-wing evangelicals or the black-hearted villain from hell if you're a comic book guy. But nobody ever, and I read his book way back, a lot of us did. You could look at that book and see that this was not a shining example of the scientific method. Among other things, he in effect discounted the validity of control groups. So I will show you 100 juvenile delinquency behind the bars kind of kids who read these trashy comic books. Well, I can show you 1 million Boy Scouts who also read them and not even committed so much as jaywalking. Anyway, Carol, as far as I know, for the first time, looked into Wortham's papers and found he'd cooked the books. He had falsified his testimony, or he'd altered it, or he'd drawn conclusions that favored his interpretation of things. Well, he's long gone, and I don't think that any reasonable modern person put very much faith in his book. And what the hell, a few years ago, we found ourselves where? In the Library of Congress. I mean, invited there by a senator, and short time close to that, Mary Frances Ann McFarland and Mike Carlin and Jeanette Kahn had lunch in the Senate dining room. And the guy who invited us wrote some introductions for us. This is a senator. He's been in the Senate for 25 years, and he's one of the real good guys. But he thought it was neat to write comic books. I'm still operating out of my first mother-in-law, not your mother, Mary. This was an evil one. And she wouldn't tell people what I did for a living because it was disreputable. A major charity organization refused our donation. It's comic books. And I was still thinking that was the case. Then all of a sudden, I wake up and find I'm on the stage of the Library of Congress, and they've got my comic books for sale. Yeah, and now, of course, we're absolutely accepted as a valid art form. But the way I stumbled into this was getting out of the Navy. I don't think our president went in. Did he go in the military? I don't remember. Anyway, and I taught for high school for a while, and I decided that what I had done in the Navy was edit a newspaper and write press releases, general journalism. I decided that, and I had written fiction in college. I had a minor in creative writing. At that time in Catholic schools like St. Louis University, everybody who was a liberal arts major was your philosophy. The school required that everybody who's a liberal arts has to take 12 hours of philosophy, which, are we talking Plato here? Are we talking Sartre? Are we talking Nietzsche? No, we are talking Thomas Aquinas for 3 years, as interpreted by a Jesuit. But we had to take that, so you take another course and you've got your minor. But I also minored in creative writing. Danny Fingerup published a magazine, comic book writing. A lot of us are now teaching it. It seems to me that virtually every major university either has a comic book course or has something like it. By the way, St. Lucie has a graphic novel course. I just saw their alumni magazine. Did they invite you? They didn't invite me either.
We should get on that. So how did you actually enter the business?
Well, I went to work for a newspaper called the Cape Girardeau Southeast Missourian because I had to fill the children's page twice a month during the summer. There were no school activities to write about. You had to scratch. I was alone and possibly the only liberal in that town. And I was pretty lonely, you know. I knew no one. Can't get drunk every night. Got a good shot. But hanging around, you know, like bus stations and drugstores, you saw comic books. And I realized, my God, I haven't even seen one of these things in about 10 years. So I bought some and I read them, and they were standing as Marvel comics. And they were funny. He had humorous captions making fun of his own characters. So, well, after all, I was a college graduate and a Navy veteran. I have a medal. And I am a literature major. I am above reading this trash, but it's kind of fun. And Stanley isn't taking it seriously. Obviously, he's joking, so that gave me permission to just go along with it as a spoof. And I think the dark reality was I was enjoying Submariner and Spider-Man. But the way Stan presented it editorially made it acceptable. And the next thing that happened is it became popular in college campuses. And then I got a letter from one Roy Thomas, whose parents subscribed to the paper. And so driving back from a visit to St. Louis one Sunday afternoon with my girlfriend, I stopped in to see this Thomas guy who was a teacher of literature at Fox High School outside St. Louis. And he opened the world for me. I had no idea that this stuff was in any way organized, that there were such things as fans, that there were people taking this seriously as an academic pursuit. And wow, I was not, my poor girlfriend Ann was, I think, bored entirely out of her mind. She was a philosophy major, but she was gracious about it. So I wrote a couple of stories about Roy, and then I started hanging out with him, and then it turns out that he was coming to New York to go to work for Mert Weisinger of Superman. And I did these stories about, you've read this story in small papers a million times. Local boy does something interesting. And so I had managed to alienate everybody in that town that I needed to do my job. I was a hippie and a peacenik and a tree-hugging peacenik at that. And the other liberal in town and I were helping the black community sub-rosa. I mean, it was a rigorously bigoted town. So I got a really snotty idea. Martin Luther King was very much in the news. I wrote a phony AP story about Dr. King coming to Cape Girardeau and staging a demonstration on Main Street. The first thing I did every morning was go into the police station and look at the stuff on the clipboard that the cops had to know. Thus and such a street is closed. You know. So I wrote this story and I slipped it on there and I went about my usual morning. You go to the hospitals, you go to the fire department. Got back to the office to do the boilerplate reporting. The phone rang, it was the local radio guy. He said, I don't know if you had anything to do with that Martin Luther King thing. I don't want to know. But if you had anything to do with it, do not admit it. I'm serious, don't do that. Oh my God. So I was going back to the little 2-room shack I rented that night and saw the head of detectives coming out of my apartment. I am not a user of marijuana. And that day I was very glad I was not. But the next thing that happened was my girlfriend had accepted a full scholarship to Boston U in philosophy, and Roy went to New York to work for Mort. I was getting back late from covering something one night, only guy in the office. What had happened was that Marvel Comics, which had been at best and also ran in New York publishing, was exploding. They were a college fad, and I had never gotten a full story from Roy, though he'd probably be willing to tell it to you. Anyway, he lasted for 2 weeks with Mort Weisinger. I am tempted to tell more Weisinger stories, and once again, I will be charitable. Anyway, Stan needed a second assistant, so Roy sent me the Stan Lee Marvel Writers examination. It was 4 pages of artwork. I think it was Jack Kirby. And my job, if I wished to do it, was to add copy, words to those pictures. Okay, who in this room wouldn't do that? Just for the hell of it. I mean, and I had alienated the entire town. I know it was only until they were pretty suspicious of me going in. They can spot these hippie tree huggers. Why did wear I had burned all of my bridges. It was a matter of time before the editor could find somebody else. And Annie, my girlfriend, there had been a snafu. Her living money had not come through. She was the academic stuff was covered, but she had no place. And she came from a Catholic worker family. That meant that they were activists back when it was a pretty dangerous thing. World War II. That was a real war, and her mother and her mother's best friend were leading demonstrations. So Annie had no money. I had cordial relationships with my family, but we were never close. And their attitude was the same as Mary Friend's parents. You want to be a writer or an actor? That's not a job. How are you going to support your grandchildren? So, what happened with Mary Fran was she broke my heart. Yes. We had separated for a summer to, like kind of think if we really couldn't live without each other. 4 years. And I picked her up after the 3-month hiatus, and she told me that she was never going to see me again because it was time for Mary Fran McFarland to get married. That's what you did if you were Irish Catholic in St. Louis at that time. You weren't supposed to finish college. You were supposed to get 2 years so you could get a job. Anyway, all that was happening. In one night, I got the offer from Stan, and I got the news that Ann Heaney needed help. She was living off what she could shoplift. And there was the only other liberal in town, so she sat me down, a bottle of bourbon. She said, stay here, see you in an hour. Came back, had packed my car, and that was it. In an hour's time, I went from being a small town reporter to something in New York publishing. I wasn't sure what. I remember driving out of town at 10 o'clock at night, cops following me, because it was not usual for people to be out in that town at that time. Kept driving middle of Ohio. The next day, my transmission spread itself all over the highway. I actually didn't know where Boston was. I thought, it's a big city. I'll find Aaron. How hard can it be to find Boston? So the car was dead forever, and I packed my Navy sea bag. And fortunately, my worldly goods were very few at that time. And in a driving rainstorm, I found Aunt Heeny's domicile. She rented a room. I had been hitchhiking in the rain for hours and hours. I got up, I took off my clothes, the door burst open. It was her landlady saying, "No men, I told you that, out!" So Annie Heaney and I walked out into Boston knowing no one. And I thought, well, if maybe the bus will stay open and we can stay out of the rain, and maybe tomorrow one of us will have an idea. Stuck out our thumb, somebody stopped, heard our story, gave us a place to stay. No quid pro quo. He wanted nothing in return. He was a real honest to God. Good Samaritan. So got Ann kind of squared away. Went to New York, went to 59th and Madison. Nothing was open in that building. Nothing was open on that block. Nothing seemed to be open in Manhattan on a Monday morning. I had one name, Florence Steinberg, because Stan often mentioned her in the letters columns. And she was in the phone book. So I called her from Grand Central Station and explained who I was and what I was doing there. And she said, "Well, Denny, this is a Jewish holiday." Well, we didn't have those back in Dick Giordano. But she knew where Roy was. He was living in a tenement on the Lower East Side. And I found my way down there, and the next day went to work for Smile and Stan as an editorial assistant. First thing I had to do was, Roy took me to Macy's and I bought a suit. Because even though I worked in a back office with no windows and nobody saw me from 9 to 5, the comic book business at that time was struggling desperately to become respectable. I once complained to Jack Kirby about, well, just Stan's making me wear this stuff, and he said, "Well, of course you have to wear that. This is Madison Avenue." Oh my God. I thought it was just the Vatican. It was that kind of place. It was super respectable. But boy, they had me writing comic books that first week. I wrote Millie the Model and Pets in Heady, Girls on the Go-Go. Now I can make jokes about that, and I've been known to, but I'll spare you. I now, 50 years later, am grateful, so grateful to Stan for giving me those jobs, because I had a chance to do something that nobody gets to do anymore. I had a chance to fail and not have it cost anything. I didn't know anything about writing comic books and very little about writing fiction. And it was okay, because nobody was reading those books and nobody was reading them. And I could make all the mistakes I wanted, and I learned there's stuff that people don't realize are a part of writing comics. Copy amount. Something I learned from somebody at DC very early was a comic book panel is, give or take, 1/6 of a page. It is not like movies. Will Eisner realized this early on. It is a different thing. It is a spatial relationship with the story and not a temporal one. This was a chance to learn that stuff with nothing at stake. And then he gave me some cowboys to do. Lonely rannies riding into town at sundown, looking for black bark. Well, I spent my early childhood looking at movies at the Pauline Theater, and they were always cowboys. So I got to do that, and then they let me do Doc Strange. The last dozen did Doc Strange because of the movie that Mary and I saw. I read that stuff, some of it for the first time in 40, 50 years. I was not a brilliant young writer, And the stuff is so copy heavy. These characters were real blabbermouths. But it was a way then to take the next step of, okay, now I'm doing what is the mainstay of this publishing house. I got very little help or encouragement, but I was permitted to learn. And I thought, well, this is turning out to be pretty neat. By that time, Annie Heaney had gifted me with a child. So I had a new baby. Marie Severin was enormously nice and helpful. I was befriended by Bob Kane. I was befriended by Bill Efford. You know, new kid from the Midwest, let's show him the ropes. And I wrote a little humorous piece for the letters page, and Stan printed that, and I thought, I am solid. Then he fired me. I walked in and he told me, I have not been given a reason to this moment. But all of a sudden I had a baby, about a month old, in the middle of a newspaper strike. So my sales skills, such as they were a glut on the market. Every second street corner had some reporter out of work. And we, of course, had no money and no place to go. So, but at that point,
Someone opened the door over there.
oh, well, it's probably Jim Shooter. So, I mean, we fell in with the Catholic worker. Now, in the Navy, I went into the Navy. The Catholic kid from North St. Louis, I believed it all. If we don't stop them commies in Asia, they're gonna be camping in my mother's backyard by Christmas. We had nothing to measure this again. And of course, if father said it and sister said it, we had always been told that that is true, and we bought it. So I got a little few magazine writing jobs. Stan, bless him, started giving me westerns, backups to write. Then the people, one of the people I was writing news stories for wanted a book on presidential elections written. And by that time my wife was a real radical, but she was also really interested in politics. So in effect, she did the research and I did the writing, and we got through a summer that way. And by that time, I was picking up a little work here and there. I met people. I seemed to have an aptitude for this comic book thing. I was getting work regularly. Also writing short stories for the science fiction magazines, the Pulse. And I wrote a story on the head of LBJ's head of protocol. He was a politician's son from Missouri. You pick this stuff up, and because you're motivated. If I don't manage to sell this job to you, Hefner, what's the baby gonna eat? I can tell you all that mine was the best job on the planet, especially toward the end. But at the time, if you look at Mike Uslin's movie, he made a movie about 40 years ago, some of it in our basement, and it was called something about the legends of the comics, and he looked up all of us who were still alive, and he interviewed us, and then he invited us to a premiere, and you listen to those old guys like Everett and Stan and the guys at Marvel, and almost all of the guys at DC, and they all said in effect the same thing. Now, it's known that Bob Kane did very little work on Batman, if any, after about 1947. And his chief ghost was Shelley Muldock, a charming and gracious guy. And so everybody knew that you were ghosting Batman. Why? And he said, Bob's checks didn't bounce, and that was what I was interested in. Those guys, I found this out from a book that Daddy Fingeroth wrote, they were all Jewish, with, I can think of one exception, the editorial staff, Vin Sullivan. They couldn't get work because they were Jews, so they couldn't get work even at the bottom of the barrel in the pubs. But the guy who started the comic book company happened to be a Jew, and his son went on to start Mad Magazine. So that was the place in New York publishing where they could find work. It was not great work, it was not very well paying, but it did feed the kid. So that was what shaped the world. The three of us, Steve Skates, Roy, and myself, came in. I never kidded myself. I wasn't thinking in terms of art. I still don't, mostly.
Well, let me ask you about that, though. I just interject a question, because after you went from Marvel, you went to Charlton, you did make it to DC. You've spoken a lot already about, you know, your political affiliations, and your most political work, and most famously, was the work you did on Green Lantern and Green Arrow. How did that all kind of come together for you? Because that's a lot of people to this day. I mean, just last year they came out with a big Absolute edition. It's probably your most enduring work in comics.
$75 slipcover.
Yeah.
That's a comic book?
Yeah.
Well, you learn. I, at one point, was working for Dick at Charlton and
Dick
getting
Giordano.
$4 a page. I had 2 mouths to feed, besides my own. So I figured I am not going to be inspired. I've got to turn out about 6 of these stories a month just to keep food on the table. And I'm not going to be inspired 6 times a month. So what can I do with the left side of my brain, the part that is logical, if any of my brain was ever logical? What can I do that I can learn well enough to do a minimally acceptable job? And I kind of bent my efforts toward that. As I said, by that time, Steve Skates had introduced me to Dick, who would come into New York City once a week. And he would meet with me and Steve and maybe 1 or 2 other people. So I didn't try to go look for any work at Marvel, because at DC, because it was the old company. It was the stodgy old Republican, right-wing, illy retentive, you know, all that stuff that a kind of snotty 25-year-old will. It becomes very easy to label. So I walked in to see Dick one morning, and he said, "How would you like to do exactly what you're doing now, at 3 times the money?" Dick was an eloquent man.
This is Dick Giordano.
Yeah. So he dragged along Skates and Ditko and, most important of all, Jim Apparel. And we were part of the package. Now, I thought, in the arrogant ignorance of the young, that these people at DC had seen the great work that we were doing at Charlton, and they decided they had to have us in their shop. And so I went to work for Dick. I met Julie. It began my profitable and satisfying professional time of my life. And Superman's 50th anniversary, the small publisher in Ohio asked me if I would contribute to a book about Superman. And I did, from where I stood, Skates and I were pulled off the street, in effect, and given this work. So I was interviewing Paul Levitz, who at the time was the chief of the editorial department, and telling him I'm doing this piece. And he said, well, look, you don't know what happened. Well, what happened was, these guys, most of whom were veterans, they were fathers, they were church-going, solid citizens, they were eminently decent men, were fired. They were kicked out. Why? The best answer that anybody had was they had asked for some help with insurance, with health insurance, you know, general stuff that people have. Comic book guys work without a net. There are no unions. There are no medical plans. There is nothing if they fall on hard times, and that could happen to anyone. Didn't happen to me, but I recognize that I was lucky. Few of us beat the rap. So instead of, and by the way, they weren't threatening anybody, no job actions in the offing here. The company fired them, or almost all of them. The one or two that didn't get fired, you have to ask them questions about. Because they figured that somebody in the freelance community was snitching. Nobody ever proved anything. I'm not even sure I have a decent idea of who it was, but so along comes us, and we are warm bodies who can type. And that's what they were looking for. Not brilliant writers, people who could meet a deadline. And off we went. I did not know that until, Jesus, like 20 years later. Had I known that at the time, it would have been a real crisis, because I still had that baby. I needed that money. But the idea of being a scab is completely abhorrent. I don't know what, thank heaven I didn't have to make that decision. But by that time, comic books were a big honking deal all of a sudden. And I see in the audience today someone who teaches comic book writing at a prominent university, and there's probably more than one. We became respectable. Neal and I suddenly found ourselves being invited to radio programs and such things. Little by little, we found that we had become respectable, and it is now an extremely respectable business. I get most of my comic book news from the New York Times. About a dozen years ago, a SF writer friend of mine, who is also a brilliant academic and a poet and incredible guy, but when he found that Ann Heaney and Dennis O'Neil were living in his neighborhood, he would come over to read through my stash of comics. He had a really deep interest in science fiction, in pornography, which he has written. Anyone out there? Guess not. And he became interested kind of as an academic. By that time, he had been head of several graduate literature departments. He went to the Times. Somebody had written a book about comics. He went to the Times and asked if he could review that for them. We don't do that. We don't touch it. Now, as I said, I haven't seen this piece in the Times about comics since day before yesterday. If you looked with unbiased eyes, you could also say that this was an art form. If movies were an art form, this was an art form. Not the easiest. I know a few people, including somebody who shares my DNA, who have written movies. And then the guy who wrote the first Batman movie in 1960, you become friendly with these guys. They all say it's harder as a technical exercise to do comics because film writers have so many more resources. they've got the resource of an actor's charisma and voice. They have motion, they have music, they have sound effects. They have a whole lot of storytelling tools. We have pictures and letters and colors sometimes. And that's it. A few people really understood the strengths of comics as a storytelling medium. Most, I'm afraid, not. But I have certainly no complaints about what I do for a living anymore. If I had stayed in Missouri, I'd have still been writing stories about the Baptist church supper on Wednesday evening and being bored.
Let's open up the to the audience over there first. Yes, you with your hand up there.
I love your turtleneck. I would also say, I like to ask, how would you have...
Yeah, me and Steve Jobs, you know.
How would you have the question in Green Arrow take down Donald Trump?
The question for since we're recording it, to repeat it in case you couldn't hear, was how would you have the question and Green Arrow take down Donald Trump?
Well, the first question is, could I write those stories? I don't know what the politics at those companies are. At the time that we did GLGA, I don't think Julie bothered to ask anybody. He once told me, it used to be conventional wisdom, you can't have continued stories in comics because the distribution in the newsstands was so irregular. If they got Detective 473, there was no guarantee they could get 474. But Julie broke that rule every year. Once a year, some voodoo thing between the dimensions dissolved. It seems to happen every 10 minutes now on the Flash TV show. The old Justice League and the new Justice Society got together and had a fight with bad guys. And I said, Julie, that was against the, how did you get away with that? And he said, they didn't ask. So with Green Lantern and Green Arrow, in my weekly visit with Julie, he said, do I have any ideas for these characters? Because he, I think, more than anybody, wanted Green Lantern to survive. He really loved the character. It was science fiction, and Julie's background, his first job in publishing was as an agent for science fiction writers. And he also edited one of the first SF fanzines. So he wanted to keep it going and he didn't know how. So I had, at that point, written a story for him in the Justice League about that river in Ohio, which is Cuyahoga, yeah. It caught fire, literally, this happened. And I'd done a JLA story for that, which was well enough received, I guess. And then when I was still working for Dick at Charlton, he was all set to do teenage psychedelic love, and all the plates were ready, and then at the last minute, permissions fell through. So he said, can you give me something, 22 pages by Friday? So he was saying, write anything you want, so I wrote a pro-past story. And that was surprisingly successful. So here was this guy, and I had already, I think by that time I had revamped, with his help, let me say, that anything I'm about to describe, mentally add the words Julia Schwartz to it. Despite what the Republicans think, none of us do any of this alone. At the very least, we're influenced by what we've read. So anyway, I went home and wrote Green Lantern 76, thinking that Ghul King was going to do it because Ghul was the Green Lantern guy. I later found out that from Neal Adams, as a matter of fact, Ghul had taken a job with Archie to do a kind of hard-boiled detective thing. That left that open. So Neal, in his telling of the story, had always wanted really wanted to do Green Lantern, so he asked for, or let Julie know that Julie needed somebody to go with my script. I think that, well, one of the things that really pleases me is the last 3 panels in the first chapter. A Florida politician named, believe it or not, Grayson, used that as campaign material. He rewrote the dialogue. I've since gotten to know I'm a really good guy. Don't know how he stumbled into that project.
We have time for 2 quick last questions. I'm sorry, I saw you in the red shirt earlier, so go on ahead. We have about 5 minutes.
When you decided to revamp the question, was that a character you had like some kind of an affection for, or did that get pushed on you?
Absolutely no affection. I was walking back from dinner with Paul Levitz one night. I'd been working as an editor for 6 months. Paul said, "When are you going to write something for us?" I said, "What's available?" What was available was Captain Atom and the Question. Problem with the Question was it was Steve Dick. I respect Steve's fierce belief in what he believes in, but we could not be at further ends of the cosmos as far as politics goes, and he's vehement about it. The other was Captain Atom. I wrote Superman for a time, and I've always been uncomfortable with characters who are God, and that's really what Superman was for a while. He blew out stars. The Question seemed to be a human-sized character, so I said, okay, I'll do that. I was given 6 months to get ready for it, unheard of luxury, and I was sharing an office with the editor. Now, later, Glenn Wein, another of our old-time greats, said, if you were going to change it that much, why didn't you just create a new character? A very good question. The simple but truthful answer is it never occurred to me. Paul said, you do the Question, and it never occurred to me that what I did, Steve Ditko probably found deeply offensive, because it is so unlike everything that's about him. Had I to do it again, of course, I would just do the character and call him the Query, or something. I think Steve that was the second time I did something like that to him. And he's very vehement if you get him on the subject of politics, especially Ayn Rand. Other than that, he's a very quiet, kind of gentlemanly guy.
We have time for one more question. Go ahead.
Let's talk about the creation of Ra's al Ghul, the demons that you created. Did Sax Mama's Fu Manchu, did you look to Sax Mama Fu Manchu as the inspiration for creating Ra's al Ghul?
You know, somebody always brings up that son of a bitch. Is Marv Wolfman in the room today? I think it may have been.
Tomorrow, it'll be in your
I didn't know.
All right, you're not going to believe this. I sure as hell wouldn't believe this. But what happened was Julie and I decided between us we should create a new major villain, because we kept going back to the well for the Penguin and the Joker and so on. He had to be a major villain. He had to be somebody worthy of Batman. He should preferably not be a guy in a funny suit, because that was really old news by then. So Julie and I worked out the story, and I wanted to give a voice to the pro-environment issue. Earlier, with creating Leslie Tompkins, I gave a voice to pacifism. I thought that stuff should be in the story somewhere. So I created that character, and we brought him on, and all went well until I think the first movie, and then some real honest to God reporters called me, and one of them told me about that, and I thought, my God, is that possible? I did not consciously do it, but that doesn't mean I didn't do it. I know I never read a Sax Rohmer novel, that I would have remembered, but the movies, I saw a lot of really crummy movies on Times Square. I'd buy a cigar at the corner store, and that would surround me with a poisonous cloud that would keep people from wanting to put their hands on my knee. It is possible, especially since I sometimes was not sober for all of those things. It's possible I saw one of those movies somewhere back then.
Christopher,
No,
Christopher
no,
Lee.
I'm sorry, we do have, there's another panel coming in, we do have to wrap it up. I'm
Sorry.
sorry, I think the gentleman, Denny O'Neil.